The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Beloved of God, grace to you and peace from the one who created us, redeemed us, and moves among us still. Amen. In our first reading this morning, we hear about the prophet Elijah. His name means, "My God is Yahweh," which gives us a good clue as to what his life was all about. The word Yahweh, if that's new for you, comes from the four-letter Hebrew word for the God of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Miriam and Moses, the God of the biblical prophets, the God of you, and the God of me. Elijah spent his life defending the worship of Yahweh against idolatry, which was a much, much bigger deal in the ancient world than it might sound to our ears today. By the time we enter the story in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings, Elijah had just experienced one of the greatest victories that any of the biblical prophets had ever achieved. The Canaanite people and their king and queen, Ahab and Jezebel, were zealous followers of the false god Baal. Now, the full story is as long and epic as the HBO's A Game of Thrones, but suffice it to say that Elijah issued a supreme throwdown to King Ahab. He suggested an unprecedented contest between Yahweh and Baal to prove who was the true God. Elijah and King Ahab meet on Mount Carmel, and more than 450 prophets of Baal joined the Canaanite king. Elijah prepares a sacrifice to Yahweh, which was common in that time, and calls on God to help him establish victory over the followers of Baal. And Yahweh does not disappoint. He rains down fire on Mount Carmel, burning up the sacrifice and all of the prophets of Baal along with it. When Queen Jezebel learns of Yahweh's stunning victory over Baal and the prophets, she is enraged. She sends a messenger to Elijah with a vow that she will do to him exactly as his God has done to her people, and then some. After years of fighting to defend Yahweh and working to return God's people back to faithfulness, Elijah is too exhausted in body and in spirit to imagine yet another fight, this time with Queen Jezebel. He quickly sinks into a spiritual depression and flees into the wilderness. He sits down under a tree and begs God that he might die. But God is not done with Elijah yet. God sends an angel to provide food and spiritual strength to Elijah, who then travels 40 days and 40 nights, the same amount of time that Jesus would later spend in his own spiritual wilderness, until he gets to Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, where Moses had received God's call so many generations ago. Our first reading from this morning picks up the story here. Elijah finds a cave on the mountain of God and crawls inside to rest. But as soon as Elijah gets settled, the word of the Lord comes to him, telling him that God is about to pass by. And this is the part of the story that really captured me this week. Elijah is suddenly awake and alert, waiting for God to meet him on that mountain. But God doesn't show up in the kind of natural phenomena that you'd think would signal the presence of the holy. A great wind whirls by, so strong and fierce that it splits the mountains and breaks boulders into pieces. But God was not in the whirlwind. Then an earthquake comes, but God wasn't in the earthquake, nor in the raging fire that follows. Finally, there comes the sound of sheer silence, clear and piercing. Elijah knows that the silence ringing in his ears is the sound of God. He also knows that coming face to face with the mystery of God's power could kill him, so he wraps his face in his cloak before stepping out to hear the message that God has for him. So I admit that I'm a little bit surprised to hear that God is not in the whirlwind, because it seems like so many people and things are shouting at us from within the whirlwind these days, claiming that they speak for God. It's virtually impossible to tune them out. They're loud enough to split mountains and crack boulders. They shout at us from hurricanes and tropical storms, from cable news networks and social media feeds, from great swells of protesters, and from conspiracy theory internet stories gone viral. They pick up speed and they spin until we're all sucked in together with the false gods of money and power and security and nationalism, whipping our hair back as they roar their empty promises into the wind. The sound of the wind is both deafening and desensitizing. The shouting is so constant that we don't even realize we're hearing it after a while. It just becomes part of the background noise of our daily lives. Kind of like the leaf blowers you've resigned yourself to accepting are just always going to interrupt your morning cup of coffee, but that you somehow don't even really notice anymore. We're all in this whirlwind together, but the wind is so strong that it distorts people from across the way. You might see someone standing a short distance away and wave. Your eyes crinkle a little bit at the corners, and you hope it's enough to communicate the smile that's hiding behind your mask. But the wind is so strong that it makes it hard to see each other for who we really are. Your wave is mistaken for a shaking fist, and your crinkled up smiling eyes are red as a glare. You see another person with outstretched arms, but you can't tell through the wind if their arms are open to hug you or to push you away, and so you push back against the wind and against them, just to protect yourself, just in case. If you've ever had to brace yourself against a strong wind as you walked outside on the precipice of a storm settling in, you know how exhausting it is. It makes your muscles tighten and your jaw clench, and your brow has to furrow to protect your eyes from the dirt and debris that the wind whips up. Your body is already tense, and so when you realize that you also can't hear anyone in the whirlwind, the exhaustion and the frustration of it all means that we end up just shouting at each other, even at the ones we love most in the world, even over things as trivial as who's going to empty the dishwasher this time. The whirlwind strips us of any measure of control we once thought we had over our lives. That would be all well and good. A powerful spiritual invitation to hold less tightly to things that don't matter even, if we could find our footing long enough to remain upright in the wind. But the whirlwind is intent on pushing us around, and so we stumble and we get scared. And because we're scared, we start to believe things about ourselves and about each other that we can usually see for the lies that we are, that we're not good enough, that we or that other people are somehow beyond God's redeeming, that we're unlovable, that time is slipping away too quickly to heal all of the regrets of our lives. Anger and resentment and grief fuel our fear, and so we fight to regain control in the wind, sometimes in ways that damage our bodies, or our spirits, or our relationships, or our communities, or our neighbors, who are also being tossed about by the power of this wind. It seems like the center of the whirlwind, with its power and speed and booming voices, must be where our all-powerful God would show up. That would make sense. Or at least that's what those booming voices echoing in the whirlwind would have us believe. But the truth is, there's no room in the whirlwind for God to speak. It's too crowded in there. Our family just got back from a couple of weeks of vacation in rural northwestern Minnesota Lake Country. We spent a night in Minneapolis on our drive back to Chicago, and Jason and I decided to take the kids to the memorial that's been erected where George Floyd was killed. Mr. Floyd, of course, was an African-American man who died under the knee of a white police officer in May. His death became the catalyst for a movement across the country, and also for rioting and burning in the city that is home to many of our family and friends. The memorial site spans several blocks of the city streets of Minneapolis, and it's filled with murals and flowers, stuffed animals and letters, potted plants and handmade signs. One of those signs said simply this: "This is a sacred space, a holy ground. It is for healing." And though dozens and dozens of people walked the streets at the same time that we were there, greeted by members of the neighborhood who care for this memorial site 24 hours a day, what struck me as my family walked was the silence. It was a silence gentle enough and weighty enough to carry God's very presence on it. God's power is mighty. It is mysterious and expansive, and it turns the world upside down. But it is not destructive. It is for healing. It shows up in Jesus, who comes to us in the middle of the wildest storms, reaches out to save us when we struggle, and calms raging waters into stillness. And it shows up in the silence that pierces the air when the whirlwind finally passes us by. Through this holy silence, the voice of God comes with clarity, asking us the same question that God asked of Elijah: "What are you doing here?" As we look across the way at the others who were kneeling along with us, surrounded by the rubble that the whirlwind left behind, we are returned to ourselves. And we can remember. We came to love and to be loved. We came to hear words of truth and promise and to speak them into the world. We came to be washed into newness of life and to share a simple meal. We came to sing and to laugh and to dance, freed by the promises of God. We came, like Elijah, to be zealous for a God who never sweeps us into the whirlwind, but who surrounds us with healing silence after it has passed us by, gathering us together with all of the other seekers who have come to put each other back together again. Thanks be to God. Amen.